Well, hello, American federal government, and welcome to Chapter 3. This chapter is on federalism. The first chapter was basically why we have government, different types of government, fundamental principles that hopefully all Americans believe in, how those are defined, we continue to argue about. The second chapter is about the Constitution, the historical background of the Constitution, how it was created, the compromises to bring about the Constitution, how it's amended, and so forth. Now we're on Chapter 3, which is federalism. So federalism is the type of government we have, as opposed to, say, a unitary system. So a unitary system would be like that in Japan or in France, which is still a democracy, but it is a system where most of the power is within the hands of one government, hence the name unitary. Part of that because geographically it works, Japan being an island country makes it more convenient. But the United States is this sprawling country, and so when they created the Constitution, they recognized they're going to have shared powers between the federal government and state governments, and that's called a federalist system of government, or federalism. And so the book's going to explain what the powers are of the national government and what the powers are of the state government. One of the things it talks about, though, too, is that then state governments have obligations to each other. This is the full faith and credit clause. So, for example, if I'm driving in Arkansas and I get pulled over by the police and I show my Oklahoma driver's license and they say, oh no, we're going to take you to jail, you're driving without a license, because that Oklahoma license isn't any good here. They can't do that because they have to give full faith and credit to other state laws. Well, this can create trouble sometimes, especially, for example, when some states were legalizing interracial marriages and other states were like, no, we don't recognize that. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, because of the 14th Amendment and equal protection, and because of the full faith and credit clause, that you can't do that. And then the same thing happened, of course, with gay marriage, because, for example, some Oklahomans would go to Hawaii or Iowa or any number of, by then, 10, 15, 20 states that began to legalize same-sex marriages, come back to Oklahoma, and Oklahoma had specifically passed a law saying, we will not recognize that marriage certificate. The writing was on the wall then. You're like, no, Oklahoma, you cannot do that. The Constitution says you must give full faith and credit to other state laws. So that's kind of what that part is about. One of the things it takes a look at how it's changed over time. So first of all, one of the things you need to know is there's this tension between federal power and states' rights. Those that would argue for greater expansion of federal power would argue the Commerce Clause. And what that means is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the legislative branch has listed powers. And it says, these are the powers you have: levy and collect taxes, set up post offices, set up roads, and to declare war. Those are the powers of Congress, of the legislative branch. And then Amendment 10 to the Constitution says, all those powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states therein. So that would seem clear, like, okay, if the federal government can't do it, it's all the state power. If it's not on that list, you can't do it. Except that Article 1, Section 8 in that list, it has all those, and then it says all powers necessary and proper to fill out the other ones. Well, what does that mean, necessary and proper? Oh man, you could interpret that so widely. Necessary and proper, and that becomes known as the elastic clause, because it's gone to broaden the powers of the federal government. So there's this tension between the elastic clause and greater expansion of federal power and those that would cite the 10th Amendment and more power to states' rights. Now, just FYI, historically, states' rights has often been used as justification to restrict individual liberties, which is in the next chapter or in individual equality. So, for example, I mentioned the case with interracial marriages. States were saying, no, federal government can't make us recognize same-sex marriages. They can't make us integrate between people of different races, segregation. Oftentimes, states' rights was a justification for that. It was also a justification for slavery. And over time, the federal government has stepped in actually to try to preserve rights for people that were being denied to people by the states, whether that be women or African Americans or other minorities, or more recently with LGBT. So, and that struggle still goes on today, because more recently you've seen a host of laws passed against transgender. We've seen that big attack against transgender and so forth, that states have passed those laws. So there's also something referred to as the difference between layer cake federalism and marble cake. So layer cake was when the country first started. It's like, okay, here's what the states do. So they're going to be in charge of health and welfare and local police powers and setting up the local roads and things like that. And then this is the national government. They're in charge of foreign affairs. They're in charge of immigration in relation between states. Nice and neat layer cake. Over time, it's become marble cake, because now, for example, we talk about the states have charge of health and welfare, but they passed the for example, during the Lyndon Johnson passed Medicaid and Medicare. So these were large federal government programs to provide health insurance to either the elderly or to poor children. But they gave the money and said, the states, it's up to you how to implement the program. Just make sure that kids can get health care, especially poor kids, because rich kids have access to health care. And that's called Medicaid. And in Oklahoma, it's called Sooner Care. And so Oklahoma does it one way and the other states do it another way. But it does lead to some problems and some debate about how that is done, and how much federal control can be over those dollars sent to the states. So that's the whole thing, layer cake federalism and marble cake federalism. Again, it talks a lot about states' rights, revenue sharing, more of a new federalism, which it discusses devolution, in that states in some ways in the last 30 or 40 years have gotten more power. And there tends to be a lot of federal-state tensions in areas. More recently, a lot of that has been over immigration. So the state of Texas recently has set up concertina wire on the border. That's razor wire. Immigration enforcement is clearly a federal responsibility. That's not in dispute, but Governor of Texas, Abbott, has tried to say that they have authority. He'll lose that argument every time. But it creates this certainly it creates this tension for sure. Other issues as well, we talk about Medicare and Medicaid and so forth, a lot of hot button social issues regarding LGBT rights often come up too. And your book talks about 3 areas where those are. Oh, most important, though, is abortion. Because now, since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, now states can outlaw abortions, and states like Oklahoma have. Other states have gone to strengthen abortion rights, but this has really created a legal mess and a legal nightmare. And that is still unplaying, and we're going to talk about that in the next chapter when we get to civil rights and get to that. So, but that's the nature of federalism. My 10 minutes is almost up, and so hopefully you get a sense of that. There's big confusion today. People don't understand the difference between state and local government and federal government and how they work. So it's fundamental to understanding American federal government. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.